My name's Harley Couper, and I'm talking today about my great-grandfather, Andrew Dougal Blair, a Dunedin boy who went away to sea at the age of 17. Back in the days before employment contracts, he had to sign a covenant of indenture for 4 years. And so as a young fella, he was aboard the brigantine, the Lyra, travelling between Australia and New Zealand and England, and learning the art of sailing. But by the time he was 20, 30, he was now a fully qualified ship's mate and in fact a captain. And he had got a job working for the Cunard line, travelling, bringing goods through the Middle East, travelling around the Yemen, into the Red Sea area and places like that. So he was already, at this time, 40 years of age, and the beginnings of conflict were resounding in that part of the world. And even before the First World War, Italy, which was a nation that had grand ambitions to become an empire, like the British Empire or the Ottoman Empire, decided it would have a crack at this. And so it invaded parts of the territories of the Ottoman Empire in North Africa. And in that conflict, the Ottoman Empire lost its navy. So here's Captain Blair, a merchant seaman in the area with business relationships with Ottoman personnel. And so the Sultan of the region he was in comes to him and says, we've got a problem. Our troops are fighting off a rebellion in some part of Yemen, and they've lost control of the wells and they're dying of thirst. Can you help? So Blair, 1911, takes, I think it's 100 tons of fresh water in the ballast of his ship, and with the aid of a condenser can make more fresh water, and he takes Turkish troops, or Ottoman troops, into this area, and they manage to get control of the wells again and then quell the rebellion. And as a result of that, the Sultan awards him this medal here, which is the fourth order of the Majetti. So the Majetti was an Ottoman medal conferred primarily from the Crimean War onwards. Only about 3,000 were ever given, and this 1911 is one of the fading years of the Ottoman Empire. So this is one of the last order of the Majettis given to foreigners of the Ottoman Empire. So a few years later, the First World War breaks out, and Blair is already sort of a middle-aged man who's got, who's decorated and has trained under sail, when a lot of the young fellas of the time were training in steam. And so he's learned both those trades, to under sail and under steam, and he's familiar with this area. So he signs up in 1914 with the Royal Naval Reserve, and he's given the rank of lieutenant. And one of his first duties is to lead a team of 6 trawlers. Trawlers were just fishing boats that had been converted for battle. They had nice big open decks, great for plonking guns on and things like that. So he's in charge of a troop of 6 trawlers, and they're travelling around the Celtic Sea, Wales, Ireland, Scotland, English coastlines, looking for mines. So because the British Navy had such superiority in the seas, the German Navy began to deploy a lot of submarines or U-boats, and they would surface and they'd lay these mines in the hope that naval ships would run into them and blow up. But not just naval ships. The problem with having such a formidable foe as the British Empire, who had the capacity to embargo your country so that there was economic warfare going on, really. Germany couldn't get the supplies it needed to feed its people. So they had to respond in kind with these U-boats by trying to threaten shipping to and from the British Empire. And so the German sub U-boats were sinking non-combat vehicles as well, non-combat ships, merchant ships. And so what are you going to do in that kind of situation? The Navy's response was basically honey traps. They would create boats that looked innocent, that weren't flying the naval flags, that looked like commercial shipping, in the hopes that these U-boats would find them and try to sink them. Now the thing with the U-boat is they can fire torpedoes from under the water. You've got no hope of combating something like that. But when you came across something that looked like it was a merchant ship, you could surface and you could pull out traditional 12-pounder guns, boom, 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 and you could sink those ships for half of the price. So the idea of these mystery ships, these honey trap ships, was to lure the submarines to the surface, because if you could do that, then you could take a pounding and they'd fill up their boats with barrels and things, so it was very buoyant, very difficult to sink. Take the pounding, and then when the U-boat came close to look at the mark, the name of the ship, so they can record it as a kill, then they would reveal themselves as an armed vehicle. Suddenly these guns would appear from nowhere, it would seem, and they'd fire on the U-boat and sink it. That was the plan, and it had moderate success. So after a couple of years of being a minesweeper, something happens that brings Andrew Dougal-Blair to the attention of the Naval Command, and that something is the Easter Rising in Ireland. The Irish tried to overthrow British rule during a time when the British Empire was otherwise engaged, and so as a result the British Empire had to pour in troops into Ireland to quell this uprising, and Blair was in that vicinity and took part of that action. In fact, he carried troops down to Arklow, I think it was called, south of the port of Dublin, or Kingsport as it was called then, to secure a munitions factory there. And the Vice Admiral of the Navy records in Blair's military record, I have a very high opinion of this chap, of this officer, I think he says. And so Blair's come to the attention of the Naval Command, despite having a little bit of a flavour for alcohol. And eventually he manages to I think damage a trawler and get himself get his commission removed from him for a couple of months while he dried out. And in that time he dries out and he gets married and he gets his act together, and they think, here's a good chap again. And so they induct him into the special service, and that's where they say to him, we want you to go and get this Dutch ship here called the Helgoland, there it is there. We want you to sail her down to Falmouth and to refit her ready as a Q ship, as a mystery ship. And she'll be called, eventually she was called Q-17. So she's one of the early mystery ships, one of the early Q ships. And they say to him, here's your sub-lieutenant, and he's going to help you fit out this new ship. And that sub-lieutenant was W.E. Sanders, who later on went on to command his own ship, the Prize, and win the Victoria Cross. So it's September, it's 1916, it's September, and they take Q-17 with Lieutenant Andrew Dougal-Blair, Sub-Lieutenant W.E. Sanders, and 25 other Marines out 10 miles south of Lizard, south of the British coastline. They go there because the day before, that day, the following day, that whole week, there were dozens and dozens of ships sunk. Italian ships, French ships, British ships, commercial ships. So the submarines are there trying to stranglehold the economy. And so out they send the Helgoland, Q-17. Blown by the wind, she has no motor, she has no wireless. So it's really kind of 17th century technology facing off were trying to lure to the surface 20th century U-boat technology. And they have success. They manage to get noticed. The trouble is, no sooner are they noticed when they are becalmed and there isn't a breath of wind. Well, if you're in a boat like this, in a ship like this, that relies on wind, you can't turn, you can't manoeuvre, you're stuck. If you look closely at this picture here, there's a little shed structure at the front and back of the ship itself. You can just make it out. Looks like a little garden shed at the back and a smaller garden shed at the front. And those might have been the captain's quarters in the past, but now they've refitted those rooms with 12-pounder guns, and there's 4 12-pounder guns on the ship, 2 6 12-pounder guns, a couple of machine guns, and all 25 Marines have a rifle. They're out at sea. They're only allowing 4 people on the surface because they want to look like an innocent little ship. And so all the other lads are down below. They've refitted it out with 12-pounder guns, and the ship itself had a very low, very shallow draft. It was a very shallow ship, so it probably bobbed around quite a bit in the water, didn't have the depth that gave it stability. So they're out 10 miles south of Lizard, and suddenly they're becalmed, and then they spot, coming to the surface on one side, a small submarine. And immediately it's all hands on deck. Well, not all hands, only 4 hands on deck. They're trying to look like a merchant ship, so as the submarine approaches, it fires on them. And it begins to blow away some of the structure along the top there. And I'll show you some pictures later of that damage. I'll just put this back there. So they're taking fire, and Skipper Smith volunteers to go to the top of the mast so he can reattach the ensign because that's been blown away. And then they notice a second submarine on the other side. So they've got 2 submarines on each side, and they're firing on the Helgoland. Well, eventually they come close enough that the Helgoland, that the Q-17 reveals who it is and begins to fire back. Now they kind of had to do that earlier than they wanted, because ideally you want to look like a very damaged ship so that they take you as done for and approach just to get the registration number or the name of the ship or whatever it is, so they can record their kill. But they've had to return fire early because they know that they haven't got the manoeuvrability. Suddenly they notice a third vessel in the vicinity. It looks like a drifter. A drifter is like a sailing ship. So there's this weird sailing ship out there with them. Only Skipper Smith up in the trees says it's not a drifter, it's a disguised submarine. So how about that? Not only are the British got their pretend merchant ships, but the British Navy have got these fake submarines that can come to the surface, put up this big this sails and look like fishing, perhaps so that when you return fire you go above the submarine or something, I'm not sure. But anyway, they figure out that it's a third submarine, and by this time they've struck the other submarines, and those are diving, and there's only one submarine left, the larger submarine, and that is right behind them, approaching, firing on them, and they realise that they can't bring their guns to bear on the submarine because they've got no wind, they've got no motor, they can't manoeuvre at all, and the deck house is in the way. And so the U-boat's got this free target that it's going for. And so Blair and Sanders get out crowbars and axes, and they start cutting down the structures on the deck house. Even the wheel was in the way, and they're cutting these things down so they could just bring the gun to bear. Boom, 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 and the submarine sinks. Well, disappears below the surface. So all of that took 10 minutes to say, but this took 2 hours. this engagement. Well, it begins to get dark, night falls, and it's completely dark. There's still no manoeuvrability, and they're all hands on deck, waiting what's going to happen next. Surely these guys are going to come back. So the machine guns are out, the 12 pounders are exposed, the 6 pounders are there, they're looking, they're waiting, and then they hear something. They hear the sound of an engine pass along the length of the boat, and the sound follows them around the front, around the other side, and they know what's going on, because these submarines, if they thought they were in danger, they didn't surface, they just circled, and with periscope they sorted out who was their enemy. So these guys knew that something was up. So they've heard the sound of this engine circling them, and then they spot a British trawler. So they signal for that trawler to come over here. The trawler approaches, they explain their predicament. You know, we've got no engine, we've got no wind, we've been in combat with 3 submarines, there's one in the vicinity, you need to attach a rope and take us back into Falmouth. So the trawler comes alongside, and just as he's coming alongside, they notice along the surface of the water the wake of a torpedo coming straight towards them, and it misses the trawler and it goes right underneath Q17. Remember how I said it had a very shallow draft? Well, that shallow draft saved them. So the trawler attaches the rope and begins to pull them towards Falmouth, and just as it's doing so, they spot a second torpedo coming straight towards them, and it travels right underneath them. Again, that shallow draft saved them. And so it's 5 o'clock the next morning that they make it into Falmouth, thoroughly exhausted, and I gather that the Helgoland was subsequently outfitted with an engine. Anyway, here is a picture of Blair. I'm not sure who this chap to the side of him is, but this here is W.E. Sanders. The photograph, I think, has been developed in reverse, judging by the fold of his cloak. So I think we have seen that photo in museums and things, the other way oriented, and we see damage aboard. We always believed it was the Helgoland, and certainly within this photograph album that belonged to Blair, this is portrayed as damage aboard the Helgoland, but often in the historic record it's portrayed as Sanders sitting aboard the prize, who he later commanded himself. I'm not sure whose it is, but whatever it is, it's a great photo. So after this battle, Blair returned to minesweeping, and then later on became transport officer, and he was involved in the British Army of the Rhine when the Allied forces occupied Germany, and then after that he carried on trading in the Middle East until his retirement in the 20s, I believe. And he told that story of his battle aboard Q17, and it was recorded by a journalist at that meeting, and that article is within this album. That's the only reason we know of that battle. So there we have it. And these are his First World War medals: 1914-15 Star, the British War Medal, the Victoria Medal.
So it's interesting that he's got a Turkish medal alongside.
Victory Medal, I should say. Yeah, it is interesting.
Yeah, both sides. And so how did the album come to you?
Well, the album I didn't know about until a few years ago. It was in the possession of my uncle. We were, in my family, we always had this chest that sat at the back of my parents' wardrobe, and it was a footlocker, one of those footlockers that groaned when you opened it up, and then sighed, this big camphor smelling sigh, and inside could be the most boring things on earth, but it was always mysterious to you because this amazing chest that had been part of the First World War, according to my parents. And we had nothing else. My mum always referred to him as A.D. Blair, so I always imagined him as being A.D., A-I-D-Y. And she talked about him being a gun runner and combating pirates and all sorts of things. So we had these images in our mind of Blackbeard or these square-jawed naval, clean-shaven naval officers, or all these stereotypes and myths. And he had a pet lion and things like that. And when you thought, oh, really? So it was about 3 or 4 years ago I began to look into what's the real story of AD. And I always thought he was Alexander Blair, because my brother is David Alexander Blair Cooper. But no, it's Andrew Dougal Blair. And so we're working at the library to use Find My Past and Ancestry.com, those kind of databases that you can get at your library, and looking at his military record, and finally getting a hold of this photograph album from my uncle. Was able to really piece together a lot more of his story. And Papers Past too, I came across the description of how he won the 4th Order of the Mejidi from Papers Past article.
And is that when you found the article the journalist had written about his engagements during the war?
No, because that article is on paper here, along with some sort of mention of dispatches type stuff from the Vice Admiral, and a couple of letters from W.E. Sanders himself. So they're all sort of tucked away in envelopes. This Covenant of Adventure is in here. He and Sanders kept up a correspondence after their service aboard Q-17, and in fact one of Sanders' letters is written after he's heard that he's getting the Victoria Cross, but before obviously he was sunk and died at sea.
And did the medals come to you at the same time as the photograph album?
No, the medals have actually only come to me in the last few weeks when my uncle passed away, and I've had them mounted.
And do you intend to keep it all together as a collection?
Yeah, sure. They sit in the camphor check in the little box that goes when you open the lid and size camphor. It's in there. It's my little ancestry shrine, I don't know. It's fun putting somebody who's not in history but has lived a really interesting life, actually collecting that all together and telling a story and putting it out there. We made a little Kindle book for sale on Amazon, which you can see at bit.ly/Q-ship versus U-boat, and that'll take you to the little Kindle book which describes his history, and he's on the Tauranga memory site, and so it's cool to see that he's starting to turn up there and be part of the historic record as well as just the family oral record.
The story's being told. So how does this relate now to Anzac Day for you? Is it make it a lot more personal?
I guess for sure. I mean, we didn't even really know if he'd been involved in the First World War until a few years ago. We'd known about this conflict, and we knew that he'd been a trader in the Middle East, and that he did incidentally get his lion. He had a little pet lion on his ship later on, which we think was sold to the Chicago Zoo later on. But we know that he met Bedouins that had been working with Lawrence of Arabia, and that he'd been to Africa and India, and we know all these interesting parts of his merchant life, but we didn't really know that he'd been involved in the First World War at all.